In the early 1960s, humanity stood at the brink of a new era in space exploration. The Cold War was in full swing, and the race to conquer space had become a battlefield of technological and ideological supremacy. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had set their sights on the stars, and the 1960s would become a decade marked by fierce competition, scientific breakthroughs, and remarkable human achievements. Among these milestones, the Gemini program would play a pivotal role, laying the foundation for one of mankind's greatest accomplishments, landing a man on the moon. The Gemini program, America's moon mission strategy. The United States' path to the moon wasn't just about technological advancements. It was about rigorous preparation and testing. The Gemini program, launched in 1961, was NASA's second manned spaceflight program and was designed specifically to test the critical elements needed for the Apollo missions. With Gemini, NASA set ambitious goals: to test astronauts in space for extended periods, develop spacecraft docking and orbiting techniques, and perfect the complex procedures for re-entry and landing. But what made Gemini truly groundbreaking wasn't just these technical feats. It was the human element. Prior to Gemini, space missions were typically solo affairs, with astronauts going into space on their own, as was the case with the Mercury program. But Gemini changed all that. For the first time, NASA launched missions with 2 astronauts aboard, testing not only the technology, but also the dynamics of working together in the harsh, uncharted environment of space. These multi-crew flights would lay the groundwork for future long-duration space travel and prove that astronauts could live and work in space for extended periods. Gemini's goals went far beyond the typical space missions. The program tested the limits of human endurance and the mental fortitude needed for deep space exploration. Astronauts had to work in close quarters, conduct complex spacewalks, and adapt to life in zero gravity. Gemini's challenges mirrored what would eventually be needed for a moon landing, and the lessons learned here would prove invaluable in the years that followed. The Soviet Union's pioneering achievements. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was making its own strides in space exploration. The Soviets had already achieved several notable firsts, including the launch of the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, and the first human spaceflight by Yuri Gagarin in 1961. But in 1965, they achieved another remarkable milestone with the launch of the Voskhod spacecraft. This mission was unique because, unlike previous Soviet spaceflights, the Voskhod carried multiple cosmonauts, marking another first in human space exploration. However, the real breakthrough came on March 18, 1965, when Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov made history by becoming the first human to walk in space. For 20 minutes, Leonov floated outside his spacecraft, tethered by an umbilical cord. It was a dangerous and uncharted endeavor, but it proved that humanity could survive in space for extended periods outside the protection of the spacecraft. Leonov's spacewalk was a groundbreaking achievement, one that captured the world's imagination and made headlines across the globe. This was a triumph for the Soviet Union in the space race, but it would not be long before the United States responded with its own historical spacewalk. Just 3 months later, on June 3, 1965, American astronaut Edward White would make history aboard the Gemini 4 mission. Edward White, the first American spacewalker on Gemini 4, astronaut Edward White became the first American to walk in space, a moment that would forever be etched in history. White's spacewalk lasted for 23 minutes, But what set his experience apart from Leonov's was the use of jet propulsion. For the first time, an astronaut could maneuver away from the spacecraft and move in space with controlled movement. White's use of a small, handheld jet propulsion unit was a revolutionary leap forward in human space exploration. It allowed him to push off from the spacecraft and move freely in space, gliding like a pioneer in an entirely new frontier. White's successful spacewalk was a critical moment in the space race, not only because of its historic nature, but because it set the stage for future space missions. The propulsion system White used would become a vital tool in future spacewalks, opening the door to more complex and extended activities outside spacecraft, and eventually on the lunar surface. Though the Soviet Union seemed to have an early lead in the space race, with achievements like Leonov's spacewalk and the first multi-manned spaceflights, NASA's approach to the Gemini program was methodical and strategically designed. It wasn't just about beating the Soviets to the next milestone. Gemini was about laying a solid foundation for the Apollo program, the mission that would eventually achieve the goals set by President John F. Kennedy to land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. The importance of Gemini in the Apollo program. While it might have appeared that the Soviets were leading the race, the U.S. was following a carefully planned, long-term strategy. The Gemini missions weren't simply about one-upmanship. They were critical tests to ensure the success of the Apollo missions, which would culminate in the moon landing. Each Gemini flight, each test, and each spacewalk provided invaluable experience and lessons that would directly inform the Apollo program. For example, the spacecraft docking procedures that were tested during Gemini missions would become crucial for Apollo's lunar rendezvous with the command and lunar modules. The lengthy space flights that tested astronauts' physical and mental endurance would help NASA understand the challenges of long-duration space travel, which was vital for a journey to the moon. And the techniques developed for safe re-entry and landing would be essential for ensuring astronauts could return safely to Earth after their missions. Gemini also provided the first significant experience with extravehicular activity, or EVA, which would eventually be crucial for activities on the lunar surface. The spacewalks performed by both White and Leonov were important not just for the experience gained outside the spacecraft, but for the development of new technologies and procedures that would be applied to the Apollo missions. The race to the moon, a new frontier in human achievement. Throughout the mid-1960s, as the U.S. and the Soviet Union raced toward their respective goals, the Gemini missions demonstrated how essential collaboration, innovation, and perseverance were to space exploration. While both nations sought to outdo each other, it became clear that each success, whether it was the Soviet spacewalks or the U.S. Gemini missions, pushed the boundaries of human potential, preparing both sides for the monumental challenges ahead. Ultimately, it was the lessons learned during the Gemini program that made the Apollo missions possible. Each milestone achieved in the Gemini program, from the first multi-crew flights to the first spacewalks, contributed to the technology, strategy, and understanding required to land a man on the moon. And in July 1969, when Apollo 11 finally reached the lunar surface, the world watched in awe as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history. But that success was not just the result of the Apollo missions. It was a result of years of testing, trial, and innovation, with the Gemini program playing a critical role in paving the way. Conclusion: a legacy of human exploration. As we look back on the 1960s, it's impossible to deny the profound impact that the Gemini program had on space exploration. It was a time of remarkable technological achievement, international competition, and human courage. The lessons learned during those early missions are still relevant today as we look toward future space exploration efforts, including Mars missions and the establishment of a permanent human presence in space. The legacy of Gemini and the space race it was part of is a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless drive to explore the unknown, whether through the bravery of astronauts walking in space or the carefully calculated steps taken by NASA to reach the moon. The 1960s set the stage for an era of unprecedented exploration that continues to inspire humanity today. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.